Hey everybody, it's Beverly again, and I hope everybody's having a very good day or evening, whatever it could be. Today I thought I would sit down and talk a little bit about a topic that's infiltrated my life, I guess all of my life. And being blind, I had a very interesting upbringing because I grew up in the 60s and the 70s, and that was before the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, was ever enacted or implemented. And there were some guidelines and things that were used sometimes in education in the 70s, but my education began in the mid 60s. So I wasn't privy to any sort of protections or rights or abilities that were given to me, you know, like everyone else. So I think I'll go back because what I and I don't I don't want to ramble in this because it's a very important topic, and I think it's a very unique situation as I see people today that are blind that are so capable. And I think what a wonderful change has gone on during my lifetime in the ability for people that are visually impaired and blind to be educated, you know, where they live and with their own set of techniques and devices and adaptations for the blind. And that wasn't given to me, and I don't hold any resentment against that, but I do get questions. I do get comments from people who have known me, and they ask, how could you go to school and you say you couldn't see? And I think the best way for me to answer that is to explain that when I was first diagnosed, again, if you've seen my video on 4 diagnoses, one eye disease, that's a video that I made that explains how my eye disease and science has progressed. But when I was first diagnosed and the doctors knew that I had a central vision loss, and my very best visual acuity ever measured was 20/200, and that is the definition of legal blindness, 20/200 in your best eye with your best correction. So that means that with the best glasses they could put on me, they didn't have contact lenses back then, and it wasn't a refractive error, so there really weren't any glasses, but hypothetically, the broad definition of legal blindness is 20/200 visual acuity in your best eye with best correction, or a field vision of 20 degrees or less. And that pertains to people that might have retinitis pigmentosa, which is a standard type where they lose their peripheral vision and it becomes, you know, darker and darker, and they still have good central vision, but they might only have 20 degrees. People that have glaucoma many times will have what's called tunnel vision, because it presses the pressure of the area of the eye will press on the optic nerve, and it will cause a deterioration of your peripheral vision. And your peripheral vision, again, are your rods, your ability to see movement very keenly, to see in dim light, and to see gross objects, you know, big objects, but not fine detailed work. And I was always missing the central part, so I was missing the fine detailed work. But when I was diagnosed and my parents sat with the ophthalmologist, their instructions from the specialist that saw me and diagnosed me was the best thing that you can do for Beverly, for your daughter, is to not allow the rest of the world to know that she can't see, because that will place a stigma on her which will be much more disabling than the blindness itself. So that was I think that was a hard concept for my parents to wrap their head around, um, because it seems like a paradox, but they knew in reality, because they grew up in the 40s and 50s. So they knew that if even people then with glasses or thick glasses had a stigma attached to them, people with leg braces, people in wheelchairs had stigmas attached to them because they were seen as people that were invalid, base word being invalid. So they did not want that for me, and here they had a specialist telling them the best thing you can do is to pretend that she can see. So don't let anyone know that she can't see unless it's absolutely positively necessary. So when I started my education, you know, I knew it when I was diagnosed that I couldn't see like my brother, and now even my sister, who is 4 years younger than me. You know, I had realized that it's not a thing. It's good sight is not a thing you develop as you get older, because now my little tiny baby sister could see so much better than I could. So I knew that by age 5, I was very, very different in what I saw and what other people could see. But I didn't know to what extent, because I had never experienced normal vision as far as my recollection can tell me. So I started in just a regular, my parents had a decision to make, and they made the decision to keep me at home and not send me to a residential school for the blind at age 6. And I came from a small town, and my father and his entire family had been in the same town for, over 150 years. So it was like people knew us, and I think their strategy was, we can talk with Beverly's teachers and explain to them that she has a disability. Of course, back then they didn't call it that. They changed that in the 70s. She has a handicapped, I guess. I guess they call it a handicap. And she can't see like other children, and she will need to get close to the blackboard if the desk in the room will allow that without her being obtrusive. So so I started out, basically in kindergarten, in a small kindergarten at age 5, with a lot of friends and my socialization. And I think some of my friends just picked up on the fact that I couldn't see, but I couldn't talk to them about it because I wasn't supposed to. I got the indirect message through correction and through socialization that I wasn't to let other people know that I couldn't see normally. So just in regular things like exploring my world in a preschool setting, kindergarten setting, outside of the classroom, when I would go to friends' houses or to the store, or I wasn't allowed to touch things. Well, kids back then weren't allowed to touch things anyway, because kids were a little, it was a little bit different, in child rearing. But in my household, my mom stayed home, and so us kids got to go everywhere that she had to go, which was to the dry cleaners and to the clothing stores and to the grocery stores and to the utility companies to pay the bills. And so we get to tag along with that. And so in doing that, my hands had to always stay to myself, and so I couldn't explore what was around me. And so I think in that sense, my early education, I missed out just on learning things about my world. So I started picking up cues, auditory cues. What did people talk about? What did they put value on when they spoke their words? What were they seeing in the environment that I was in, but I couldn't explore? So, so that was kind of how I began my kindergarten years, and and in kindergarten, you learn things like socialization with other children, and certainly I think the goals were learning your colors, learning to tie your shoes, learning your alphabet, and learning maybe some basic words. And we had music, and we had playground, and we had those kinds of things. On the playground, I excelled. As a girl, we weren't allowed to wear pants though. So there was this other a stigma that was attached that, I was a girl and we always had to wear a dress to kindergarten. And I even though I was a tomboy, I ran and jumped and played and swang on the swings and climbed the monkey bars. I was limited in my attire because of my gender. Um, the In the classroom, I could move about very agilely. I had very good mobility vision for somebody who had a measured visual acuity of 20 over 200. So what I had difficulty in doing was seeing print, seeing alphabet, such that was being introduced to us at that age. So it's like learning a new language, and it was not an auditory language, it was a visual language. So, and I was fascinated by the visual. I know I'm a very, very visual person. If you've seen my video on color perception, you will understand that. And if you haven't seen that, you might want to look at that. But I'm a very, very visual person that doesn't have vision. And at age 5, I would look as closely as I was allowed to look. In my classroom, my teacher did let me look very closely, so my eyes were about 3 inches away from my paper. When my friends, could sit back and see how to color and see how to make their A or their B or their C. And I had to look very closely, but I could see it pretty clearly if I looked real close. The issue was there was a dilemma at that time. If I used my eyes too much, the thought was way back then that my eyes would wear out sooner than later. So there was this thing called sight saving. And it was a theory, and it was a concept, and it was adapted. And so, there was this thing that, well, let's learn ABCs as quickly as possible, and then quit looking at things closely, because whatever little vision I had, it would wear out. And so I would get, the instruction, okay, that's enough ABCs, that's enough writing for today. So in that little bit of time that I was allowed to actually see printed letters, I soaked it up like a sponge, and I just loved writing my letters. I didn't like reading because I wasn't able to read from right to left like the English language is printed. My blind spots in the central part of my macula were always slightly to the right of where I was looking. So it is as if you had a hole cut out in a page, and you were only allowed to see one word at a time. My blind spot allowed me only to see maybe 3 letters at a time. I have never been able to glance down, even as I could get it close, and I could see maybe the word thank you. I could see the THA, but then I would have to move my eyes to see the NK space and then a YO and then maybe a U. So no matter how quickly I could identify the letters, I could never track the line fast enough to read from right to left. I remember visiting a synagogue once as a child, and I learned that in Hebrew, they read left to right. And there are collimated reading languages. And so I learned at a very early age that, gosh, if I could just read, and I'm sorry, I meant right to left. If I could read right to left, then my blind spot's always going to be behind where I'm reading, and I could read very quickly and maybe keep up with everybody else in my class. But that was not the case. And so I learned my alphabet. I learned using a pencil. I could see the pencil. I could see the bold line paper with the dotted lines in between. And I loved practicing to make my letters perfect. I just really enjoyed that. And I enjoyed drawing. I enjoyed coloring. So I was kind of visually, I wouldn't say artistic, but my mind tilted that way. So I really enjoyed that spatial visual perception of learning to write my alphabet. And then by the time I got to first grade, I went to our public school, and this was, again, the early 60s, mid 60s, where we were in the baby boom bulge. And so we were so overcrowded in our school system. I remember when I went to first grade, my first grade teacher had 48 children in the classroom. And if you know anything about education now, I know now my grandchildren are educated, and there's a maximum of 20, 22, and that's a lot of kids there to educate. So I was a visually impaired, legally blind child in a classroom of 48 children. And so I know my teacher did everything she could to give me as much attention as possible. And my parents, my mom especially, because it was designated to her, to meet with my teachers at the beginning of each year to explain, this is what Beverly sees. We think she can see print if she's close enough. She can read, but very, very slowly. And she needs to learn to read, and she needs to learn to spell, and she needs to learn what all the other children are learning, but you can't isolate her out and make her different. So now the teacher has been given this request that they agreed to honor in the public school system. They didn't have to. There were no laws that said that I had to be educated in the public school system. There were no adaptations. There were no teacher's aides. So the teacher was basically saying, yes, I will take this challenge on, and doing their very best at what they could do with me. So I remember in first grade, again, the socialization wasn't as difficult. The kids, the 47 other kids knew that I was different, and I wasn't ostracized. And many times, and I sat on the very front desk in the middle of the classroom. But because the classroom was completely filled with desks, that put my desk equal to all the other front desks, and we were very close to the blackboard. I could see the teacher's hand writing on the blackboard, but I couldn't see what was written. So I remember following. I could see her pale hand and arm up against the dark green blackboard, and I could see how she was making a capital A. But then when she brought her hand away from the blackboard, I couldn't see the A. I could see how her hand made the motion against the blackboard when she made a capital C. But when she took her hand away, I couldn't see the letter on the blackboard. There was not enough contrast. Even sitting as close as I could sit, uh, and and being as close as I was. So my first grade, the print in the books were it, if you remember back to first grade, the print is pretty big as for a beginning reader. And so I could see the bold black print in most of my books if I held it close enough to my face. And my teacher would always position me in reading class, in the reading groups that we had, so that the other kids wouldn't necessarily see me with my nose up against the page. So it was kind of like, okay, I can read this book, I can learn to read as long as others don't know that I'm learning differently. And what I realized in first grade is that it really didn't matter to my classmates. They were 6, they were 7, they were some probably were 5, and they didn't really care at that age that I was different. And I think they were all being socialized at that point. And if they did care, I didn't get that feedback from them. So I was never ridiculed or bullied or made fun of. It seems like first grade I was accepted, and the teacher did exactly what my parents had asked her to do, and I thought she did an excellent job with what task she had at hand, with all the children that she had to work with. And on the playground again, I was, that was fine. There was no problem with my travel vision, my mobility vision. So I could go up and down the hallway. I could find my classroom. I did count doors because I couldn't see all the way down this very, very long corridor with classrooms on the right and left. So we would go to lunch, and I couldn't see even the next classroom, next to ours. So I remember counting doors, going to the restroom. We all had to line up back then and go to the restroom at the same time. So, I just followed the person in front of me. But if I had to go by myself, I would count doors. And I learned that just on my own because there was nobody to say, this is how you do it. And I could see steps. We had lots of steps in our school. It was a one-level school, but we had steps up and down and outside and things like that. And I had no problems with that. So the teachers were pretty well assured that I wasn't going to trip and fall. But the main part of my educational experience, we got into arithmetic and numbers and, how you do simple addition and subtraction, and you put numbers on top of each other. And I remember sitting and listening and figuring out what the teachers were saying, what my teacher was saying about, okay, if you put the 3 on top of the other 3, and then next to it on the left goes your plus sign, and then right under your bottom 3 you put a long line, and then you add 3 plus 3 and you get 6, and you write your 6 below. So what everyone else was looking at on the blackboard and picking up, luckily for me, my teacher was saying all those things. And so I picked up what I could pick up. And I remember the very last part of the school year, the first grade, and we had, I'm sure it was an achievement test to see with our words that we were sight readers, meaning that we weren't taught phonics at that time. We were taught words by sight. So you had to look at a word and identify it just because you had seen that word before and you now knew what that word was. You'd had exposure to it. So we had this long, long list of words that had been written out with a magic marker on this huge tablet in front of the classroom. And each child, all 48 of us, had to one by one get up and take the ruler and go up to the front of the class and point out the word and say it. as we read it. And there were like 3 columns of words. So I'm going to guess there were probably 50 sight words on this page. And I freaked out because I knew I would not be able to see. I couldn't see what the teacher had written on it. And now I was going to be called up in front of the class at toward the end of the year. It was toward probably April, when the year ended in May. So I thought, this is just, going to be so humiliating, even as a 6-year-old. So luckily I was on and I wasn't the first row as you walk in the door, and I wasn't the second row, the third row. I was on the 4th row, and I was the first person on the 4th row. So all these other kids, that the teacher started this exercise with the first person on the 1st row and went down that row, and each one laboriously had to get up and come in front of the class and point the words out and say the words that were on the page. So for me, by the time they had gotten to me, which they had gotten through about 23 children, I had memorized the list of 50 words. And I could probably rattle it off to you today. It's imprinted in my brain. I was not about to fail 1st grade, and I knew reading was one of the targeted milestones you had to be able to do to go to the 2nd grade. And I couldn't put my nose up on this tablet that the teacher had. And so I took the ruler, and when she called on me, and I went up to the front, and I started pointing the ruler at what I thought was the first word, and I kind of waved it across the word, and so I wasn't accurate with my pointer, but I nailed the words. And I did it so quickly that my teacher realized she's not reading these words. She has memorized these words. And she said, "Very good, Beverly, sit down." And she went to the next person. So I had passed this huge, stressful hurdle. And nothing was said. My teacher said nothing to me about it. I thought, okay, I'm going to, I did that. I nailed it. And now I'm going to get to go to 2nd grade. And the only last thing in the year, we had a play that we had to have at the end of the year. And it was a 1st grade play, and all the parents were invited, and the other teachers and the other classes, and it was in the big auditorium. And my teacher called me up to the desk, and she said, "Beverly, I want you to be the narrator." And I said, "The narrator?" I didn't know what that was. And she said, "I want you to be the person that directs our play." And I thought, okay, what do I have to do? And she said, "You just have to remember all the words that I'm going to teach you. And when you remember those words, you just have to say them out loud, and then everybody else will do what they're supposed to do." So I thought, whoa, this is awesome. So it was 2 weeks before the end of school, and I remember my parents were in the audience, and I was so proud. And on that day, I had, ironically, the day of the little assembly, I had a scheduled ophthalmology appointment in the early morning. First thing in the morning. The play was in the afternoon, and I knew I couldn't miss the play. And so by the time I got back to school and they had dilated my eyes, which was a very horrendous thing back then, your eyes just stayed wide open for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. And it wore off maybe that night, the next day. So I got up on this stage, and what tiny bit of visual acuity I had was completely blurred out. And I was kind of taken back that when I opened my eyes, even at that point, I couldn't see what I normally could see. But I had memorized my words, and I introduced the first song, and I introduced the second song, and I introduced the skits, and I introduced the students that were in the skits. And I remember nailing it and thinking, I've done this, and when I went back and realized that my teacher had known all along that I didn't read those words, that I had memorized them. She just used that to her advantage. So she would have a narrator that would memorize her lines, and needless to say, I never went into acting. I that's enough memorization for me, and it was so stressful and so traumatic that I never wanted to do that again. But that's the way I got through first grade, and the rest of my education is even more different than that, because that was the only year out of my formal public school education that I was almost allowed to be a visually impaired person in a sighted world. From then on out, it became my secret. And it was a secret that had to be held pretty closely, because I was told, and I was instructed, and it was just an innate part of how I was being socialized, that you cannot let others know how badly you see. So I wanted to share a little bit about that, because it's a concept that hopefully doesn't go on anymore. It's a concept that that is prevalent in other issues. When people have to come out and they have to share their secrets that they've been living with. And my blindness, my visual impairment, was that secret for me. Well, even throughout my college years, but I will put that in another video, which is kind of a sequel to this, and there might be a few, because there's so many parts to being blind and being socialized, and then becoming the functional person that I have become. And it was a unique start. It wasn't the blind education with teachers' aides and adaptive equipment and adaptive text and things like that in a homeschool situation, and it wasn't a residential school for the blind where I had to leave, like many people I know, and be away from their families. So it was somewhere in between, and it was my unique secret, my unique experience. And so I will save more content about this subject for other videos, because I think it's worth talking about, to give you a perspective of how different people can be educated, and how what you see is not really what you get. So it's kind of like my way to explain that you, if you're my age, could have been sitting right next to a person that was just like me and not know it, because at that point in time, it was something that was very hidden and very non-discussed. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed some of this and it wasn't too boring. And I'm gonna, like I said, I'm gonna do a sequel on this, and maybe a couple, to kind of explain socialization and actual education, how information got into my brain without accessing printed or adaptive braille, or even large print. So until next time, I'll see you later, everybody. Bye-bye.